Hello, my name is William Joseph Cobble. I'm reading an excerpt from my first book in the Contending with Paul series. This is Contending with Paul, the hidden story behind the writing of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I'll be reading an excerpt from chapter 1. On this second trip to Jerusalem, Paul says he only met primarily with the acknowledged leaders, Galatians 2:2. The Greek word means seem or appear as leaders. Paul describes the leaders in an almost disgruntled way. Quote, "And from those who are supposed to be acknowledged leaders, what they actually were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. These leaders contributed nothing to me." Galatians 2:6. In these lines, Paul may be pressing the point to his Galatian readers that his beliefs were not based on the teachings of the apostles, but had come directly from the risen Jesus. This may also show that Paul was already not completely deferring to the Jerusalem leadership, at least inwardly. How he acted outwardly is not known, but believing he had learned nothing from these men is telling. Beyond his bravado, however, is a hint that Paul may have been somewhat shaken by his encounter with the pro-circumcision teachers in Antioch. In the single verse below, he shows a rare lack of confidence as he describes the Jerusalem meeting. It is an extraordinary moment of Paul seeking validation. "Then I laid before them the gospel that I proclaim among the Gentiles, in order to make sure that I was not running or had not run in vain." Galatians 2:2. After the matter was settled in Jerusalem, Paul writes that a division of labor was agreed to. As a parting gesture, James, Peter, and John, quote, who were acknowledged pillars, same Greek word, this is sometimes translated as so-called or reputed pillars, gave to Paul the, quote, right hand of fellowship. The three leaders agreed that Paul should take the new faith to the Gentiles and they to the Jews. If things were not perfect between Paul and the Jerusalem Mother Church at this point, they were at least good enough. One additional request was made of Paul. Quote, "They ask only one thing, that we remember the poor, which was actually what I was eager to do." Galatians 2:10. The poor most likely refers to the members of the Jerusalem congregation who had sold everything and were living together communally. In several of Paul's letters, he references organizing a collection from his Gentile churches to be brought to Jerusalem. What develops in the ensuing years may be gleaned from Paul's writings. As his letters get later, his sentiments against the Mosaic Law become more acerbic. As words of his undermining of the Mosaic Law spread, they would certainly have been abrasive to the Mother Church of practicing Jews. In Exodus 31:18, the Torah is described as, quote, 2 tablets of the covenant, tablets of stone, written by the finger of God. But Paul chooses his own descriptions in 2 Corinthians 3. The ministry of death, chiseled on stone tablets, verse 7. The ministry of condemnation, verse 9. What once had glory has lost its glory because of a greater glory, verse 10. And the old covenant, verse 14. Paul will even champion a later Jewish belief that the law was not delivered directly by God on Mount Sinai, but through angels. Why then the law? It was ordained through angels by a mediator, Galatians 3:19. In the 2 Corinthians 3 passage, Paul gives his portrayal of Jews who follow the Mosaic Law. One must wonder how such depictions would have complicated the work of the Jerusalem Mother Church, whose mission it was to evangelize their Jewish brethren. Quote, "But their minds were hardened. Indeed, to this very day, when they hear the reading of the Old Covenant, the same veil is still there, since only in Christ is it set aside. Indeed, to this very day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their minds." Verses 14 through 15. It was the issue of Torah observance that ultimately caused a rift between Paul and the official movement. In the church of Antioch, it appears that both Jews and Gentiles dined together, which would have been a revolutionary accommodation by Jews who had once been strictly committed to the purity and dietary codes of the law. When visitors from the Jerusalem Mother Church came to town, sent, quote, from James, they changed this harmonious dynamic. Immediately, the Jewish members of the congregation began acting like Jews again, an offense to Paul and certainly to the church's Gentile members. Quote, "But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood self-condemned. For until certain people came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But after they came, he drew back and kept himself separate for fear of the circumcision faction. And the other Jews joined him in this hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that they were not acting consistently with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews? Galatians 2, verses 11 through 14. Historians are bereft of not having Peter's or Barnabas' sides of this conflict. Were they simply showing proper courtesies to honor Jewish guests by not defiling them? This would be important if these visitors would need to interact with other Jews or perform religious functions later in their journey. Other questions arise as well. Does Paul call the men the circumcision faction only because they were observant Jews? Or were these another group who believed the practice of circumcision was a requirement for all believers? Could this even be his pejorative term for the entire Jewish congregation? What must be noticed is that in this single controversy, Paul puts himself in opposition to 1, the visitor sent from James, Jesus' own brother; 2, Barnabas, his fellow missionary and mentor; and 3, Peter, Jesus' chief apostle. When Paul writes of Peter, I opposed him to his face, this sounds like a scene in which his temper has flared. Also, Paul chose to chastise Peter, quote, before them all, meaning the scene occurred publicly. Such was Paul's conviction. Though Paul writes confidently of the Second Antioch dispute as if it were an argument in which he prevailed, he never actually reveals its outcome in his letter. The events that followed may point to things having not gone his way. 1, Paul and Barnabas part company after the Second Antioch incident, and Paul begins traveling with Silas instead. 2, Paul leaves Antioch and makes Ephesus his new base of operations. 3, Paul's missionary journeys move even further west into the Gentile lands and away from Jerusalem. And 4, Paul never mentions this dispute again in his letters. It should also be noted that whatever the outcome, Paul did not concede his beliefs. His letters show that he never imposes the Jewish purity or dietary regulations upon his congregations. Contending with Paul.